Welcome to the next of our Jesus talks, and in this sixth study we're concluding our examination of the birth of Jesus. Well, the birth of Jesus has become surrounded with all kinds of myths and legends, but even when we clear all those away, we're left with an event that is still beyond all human possibility, something in the deepest depths or in the highest heights. It does seem that the birth of the Messiah was signalled in the heavens, and that people from other nations and cultures in some way understood the significance of this. The birth of the Messiah may have happened in the one small nation of Israel, and yet his birth was relevant to all nations in every age. And the prophet Haggai said that the desire of all nations shall come. People argue about how that particular prophecy should be translated. Some go for the quite mundane translation that the nations desire gold and silver and they will get it. But the more traditional reading is this idea that there is this one who is all the desires of all nations, and he will come. And the birth of Jesus is in that sense this fulfillment of all these many desires of all the nations. Well, Jesus, after he was born, they had to flee to Egypt. Matthew 2 verses 13 to 15 says, "When they had gone, the Magi, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. 'Get up,' he said, 'take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him.' So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod." So the extraordinary thing is he flees this newborn Jesus to another continent, to Africa, to go back to a nation that had already played a big part in the long history of God's people, God's church, going right back thousands of years. And this behavior that Joseph received this dream and understood the meaning of it and then acted on it to go to Egypt. Well, we'll look more closely at Joseph in a future study. But for now, just let's note that he received this special dream with an angel telling him to become a refugee to Egypt to escape the brutal repression of King Herod, who seemed to understand that the birth of this child was a direct threat to his own political power, possibly even his regal dynasty. Now, this journey to Egypt has produced a great deal of speculation and further legends about Jesus of Nazareth. There have been those who say that Jesus learned how to do magic in Egypt, and that was how he did all his miracles. This strange idea comes from the fact that when we read the book of Exodus, and this is going back like 1500 BC, in that book, in the early chapters, we see the Egyptian sorcerers, magic users, using occult power and magic to try to replicate the miracles that the Lord God was doing through Moses. So when we read Exodus chapters 7 to 9, we see how these magicians were able to do some things that were amazing. But yeah, they were quickly completely outclassed by the power of the living God. But if we just take the record of those chapters in Exodus at face value, these Egyptian magic users had real power and could do extraordinary things. Well, here's where this myth about Jesus evaporates. Not only is there no hint in the eyewitness accounts that Jesus had any techniques or spells or rituals or occult powers, and even though there were some religious opponents who accused him of using satanic power, but Jesus rebuts that, and we'll get to that perhaps in a later study. So first of all, no eyewitness accounts speak about him doing anything like magic. But also, the kind of effects that were created by the Egyptian magicians back in Exodus are nothing like those done by the Lord God himself. The Egyptian magicians were able to destroy, but never to create or to heal. And so those of us that have actually bothered to look up what the ancient Egyptian magicians did and their own understanding of their own limits, that it quickly becomes completely unbelievable to imagine either that Jesus went to Egypt in order to acquire such magical skills, because he doesn't appear to have been in Egypt into his adult life. But also, there doesn't appear to be any overlap in what magic users did in Egypt and what Jesus does. And Jesus himself, as we've said, explicitly renounces having anything of that kind of power. But there may be other reasons why Jesus spent some of his childhood in Egypt. Not only had Egypt got very deep connections with the history of Israel, the history of the church, going right back to this time of Moses and the Exodus. In fact, it even goes back beyond that. In the book of Genesis, there's earlier connections with Abraham and his family. But beyond that, the great city of Alexandria had in Jesus' time become the world's centre for the study of the ancient Hebrew scriptures. The great library of Alexandria, which had been created by Alexander the Great 300 years before Jesus' birth, that, when Alexander set it up, he placed it into the care of one of the disciples of Aristotle. And the more we learn about the ancient city of Alexandria, the more we can see how fascinating and vibrant a place it must have been. For example, the great Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures was produced in Alexandria, possibly around 300 BC. And that was the very version of the Bible that Jesus himself seemed to use. So when Jesus is quoted in the biographies, he is quoted as using that Septuagint, the Greek translation of the ancient Hebrew scriptures. And in addition, in Alexandria, the greatest of all these Jewish scholars of the ancient scriptures, it was a man called Philo, and he was probably the leading Bible expert in the world at the time. There is so much we could say about Philo, and for example, he was in his studies was very clear about, for example, the divine identity of the promised Messiah, and he also seemed to believe in something like the Trinity. Sometimes when I do teaching about Philo, I take quotations of him and read them out and ask people to guess in what century those quotations come from. And everybody guesses that they were written long after the birth of Jesus and the New Testament. Sometimes people have said it like the 17th century, because they sound so Christian, the writings of Philo. Well, Philo was actually born around 30 BC, and he died maybe 50 AD, It is said that he met with Peter, one of the closest friends and followers of Jesus, and became a follower of Jesus at the church in Alexandria, founded by Mark, the writer of one of the biographies of Jesus. So not only would Jesus have been exposed to a multicultural and international society in Alexandria, he would have also had access to the greatest Bible studies in that ancient world. Now, why would a boy of 10 years of age be interested in that sort of thing? Surely he'd be more interested in, I don't know, football games than these old scrolls. But before we jump to such conclusions, there's a couple of things we should know. First, when they returned to Israel, back into Asia, they went to live in a town called Nazareth. That's the first thing to know. And the second thing is Jesus was no ordinary boy. Let's deal with these one by one. So first of all, in Matthew 2:19 to 23, it does say this: after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets: he will be called a Nazarene. Okay, well, we can't find a neat prophecy saying that the Messiah would live in the town of Nazareth. But instead, we do find ancient laws about a special vow called the Nazarite vow. It's in Numbers chapter 6. This was a vow to be taken by those who wanted to be totally dedicated to the Lord God, committed to him in a way that might seem zealous to others and socially unreasonable almost. The Nazarite had to live according to a very strict code of behavior and lifestyle while they were under this vow. Joseph took his family to live in a town called literally the town of the Nazarites. In other words, Jesus grew up in a town where people gathered to follow the absolute dedication and commitment of this special vow. Jesus grew up with people who were seriously committed to the Lord God. Even though this made them seem strange to other people, they would have looked strange because of this vow. Ordinary people didn't live in a place like Nazareth. When a man called Nathanael learned that Jesus was from Nazareth, he said, "Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth?" That's in John's biography, chapter 1, verse 46. So Jesus grew up in an unusual town surrounded by people who were following an unusually strict lifestyle of dedication to the living God. And this would be the sort of environment that would have nurtured the obsession with the scriptures that he had even as a young boy. Well, if we look on to Luke chapter 2 from verse 41, we find an incident that gives us an insight into this obsession with the scriptures of the young Jesus. It says this: every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the feast according to the custom. After the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they travelled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they didn't find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they didn't understand what he was saying to them. Now, notice some of the details here. First, his family were very careful to go to Jerusalem for the Passover feast each year. They took this very seriously. Obviously, they went in a larger group from Nazareth, and at first they assumed that Jesus was simply traveling back with other families in the group. But when they realize he's not with them, they start to look for him and eventually find him with the top Bible experts in the nation. And notice that description. They found him in the temple court, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. But everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. So yes, he was asking questions of the experts, but the experts and everybody found that this 12-year-old boy, his understanding and his answers to the questions were better than anybody else's. He was providing answers to questions that they couldn't give those answers, but they could appreciate the brilliance of them. All this from a boy of just 12 years of age. And when his parents wanted to know what he was doing, he gives this strange answer. "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they didn't understand what he was saying. He had to be, and this was the temple. So this was not a birth or childhood like any other. All the biographies agree that the origins of this man were of great significance and import. We might dream of making something of our lives, but this baby was already something of cosmic and global importance before he was even born.